Those of you that don't know me, my name is Russ Markel. I own and operate Outer Shores Expeditions and the schooner Passing Cloud. And yeah, really excited to be hosting this webinar today. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone as we get started. Like, it's been amazing in the last week, just seeing everyone sign up for this. And there's past and guests who haven't, past guests and first-time guests who are going to join us this year aboard Passing Cloud, but the broader coastal community here in British Columbia. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Welcome. There's folks from certainly the SSTOA, the Small Ship Tour Operators. Thanks, fellow tour operators. NIMSA, MERS, University of Victoria, Marine Guides Association, Galen, thanks. The commercial whale watching industry, cross-section of everything from academia to just everything that our community on the coast captures. So I'm thrilled to have everyone here today. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm really pleased to introduce my good buddy and long-term friend and colleague, Dr. Volker Deecke. And Volker's got an extensive resume CV, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but it is worth mentioning a bit more about Volker's background before I hand it over to him. Volker has trained classically in animal behavior, and then he started with a master's degree at the University of British Columbia, working with Dr. John Ford on the evolution of vocal dialects in the resident killer whale populations here on the coast, or the fish-eating orcas. Then he went on to do a PhD at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. But he continued his research here in British Columbia and Southeast Alaska, this time with the mammal-eating killer whales, the bigs or the transient killer whales that we know so much, and really looking at some very interesting kind of predator-prey dynamics between killer whales and their main prey, the harbor seals. So I'm sure we'll hear a bit about that today. He came back to British Columbia and UBC to do his postdoctoral work in the Marine Mammal Research Unit. And then now today, Volker is a professor of wildlife conservation at the University of Cumbria in the UK in the Institute of Science and Environment Conservation. So I was doing the math, Volker, and all, you've been like studying and thinking about killer whales for 25, going on 30 years. And including, thinking about behavior, ecology, conservation of these amazing, iconic kind of top predators throughout British Columbia and Southeast Alaska, and more recently the North Atlantic, Shetland Islands, Greenland. And yeah, you just mentioned that you've been doing a little bit of work with some of the Iberian orcas with these interesting vessel whale interactions, entrance to the med. And yeah, and I'm super appreciative that amidst everything you're doing and how busy you are, you still find time to join us aboard the Passing Cloud occasionally as an expedition specialist. So thanks very much. Volker's title of Volker's talk is Anything But Black and White, Killer Whales in British Columbia's Inshore Waters. Over to you, Volker.
Thank you very much, Russ, and very nice to see everyone here. Thanks for taking time out of your weekend. I've met some of you on board the Passing Cloud. I'm hoping to meet others on board the ship in the future. And yeah, it's really cool to see this level of interest. And have to preface this talk with, it's very much a collaboration. One thing that we've all learned studying killer whales and other marine mammals is that we need to work in teams to really understand what's going on. We need different expertise. We need a massive sightings network of people who are just passionate and interested about them and let us know when they see killer whales in different parts of the world. And the work that I'm presenting is very much done as part of that team. And so thanks to everyone who's contributed. First of all, this is the species that we're talking about the killer whale or sea panda or orca, call it whatever you want. I know some people don't like the word killer whale. Actually find it sort of instills a certain level of respect to the animals. These are top predators, and they do deserve to be treated with that respect. And so, I'm quite happily using that term, but, understand that other people might use orca instead. The really important thing about these animals is that there is no such thing as the killer whale. These are some really useful graphics that a wonderful graphic artist, Uko Gorta, has put together and made available to the wider community. And what you see here are killer whales from the Antarctic Ocean. And you can see that there's some general patterns. The males on the left tend to be bigger than the females, but there's also some quite striking variation, both in size. If you compare the big Antarctic type A killer whales with those puny Antarctic C killer whales, they're almost 1.5 times as long. But then also in coloration, so you've got these very typical Antarctic type A with black back, white underside. The saddle patch here behind the dorsal fin is found in all populations. If you look at the Antarctic type B, they have what we call a dorsal cape, where the body, the flank of the animal is actually two different colors, and this beautiful sort of swirl moving forward from the saddle patch meeting with the eye patch. And so from those pigmentation differences, you can tell that you're looking at different animals. And the type C also have that dorsal cape, but very different body size. Other thing that's really helpful is the eye patch. The eye patch really varies in size and orientation between the different types of killer whales. And most importantly, these animals behave very differently and eat different things. So Antarctic type B, as far as we know, are marine mammal specialists, really focusing on large whales like minke whales. That seems to be their staple in Antarctic waters. Type B seem to like things that start with the letter P, penguins and pinnipeds. And that's mostly what they've been feeding on. Those are also the ones that you may have seen on documentaries washing seals off ice floes. And then finally, the type C are fish specialists. So we only see those eat fish, mostly Antarctic toothfish. Um, this is the situation in the North Pacific. And in the North Pacific, we also have different types. We refer to them as ecotypes. You've got the very well-known North Pacific residents, and you can see the male here. One characteristic of the residents is that the tip of the dorsal fin is more falcate, so it's got this little corner here in it, and the female fin is sort of curved backwards like a little horn. And in some resident killer whales, you also find an open saddle where there's a patch of black sort of running into that gray saddle patch. You don't find that in the North Pacific transients. They never have open saddles. Size-wise, they're quite similar. If anything, the transients are a bit bigger. And the dorsal fin is a bit more shark-like, with the tip sort of right above the trailing edge of the dorsal fin. And then in the North Pacific, you find a third type, the offshores, that we know comparatively little about. And we do know that they tend to be further offshore, although they have been seen in areas like Johnson Strait or the Salish Sea, but most of the time they're probably closer to the continental shelf. North Pacific residents are probably one of the best studied population of mammals in the world. The animals have been studied very systematically since the 1970s, so they're right up there with the chimpanzees of Gombe or the long-term study of red deer on the island of Rum. So animals that we actually know a lot about. North Pacific residents are fish specialists, and as I'll show you later, from all the fish that they might eat, they actually really favor North Pacific salmon, particularly the large Chinook or spring salmon in the coastal waters. North Pacific transients are mammal hunters, so in 40 years of study, we've never seen them consume fish. They're after warm-blooded prey. They take seals, they take sea lions, harbor porpoise, Dall's porpoise, some of the dolphin species, but also minke whales. North Pacific offshores we know relatively little about, but the data suggest that they're focusing on sharks. So they've been seen, for example, feeding on Pacific sleeper sharks, mostly focusing on the liver of these animals, although they may be taking other fish as well. So that's the situation of killer whales in the North Pacific. Today, I'll mostly focus on the mammal hunting killer whales and on the fish eating killer whales, and sadly, not much about the Pacific offshores. And that's mostly because, I myself have only seen them a few times and we know relatively little about them. So this is a photograph taken by my friend and colleague Jared Towers. And this is a classic photograph of a North Pacific resident, big salmon in its mouth that it's obviously showing off as it passed the boat. This is a typical photograph of a North Pacific transient patrolling a sea line haulout, looking perhaps for a injured or sick animal in the water that it might attack. So the animals are quite different. They look different. They inhabit the same waters, but they rarely actually ever interact. Mostly they sort of keep out of each other's way, and genetic studies show very clearly that they don't interbreed and they haven't interbred for probably hundreds of generations. So they're almost two different species in the making, and may eventually diverge to the point that they actually look quite different. Um, this is a map here of the coastal waters of British Columbia. Anybody who's been on the passing cloud will obviously recognize the channels and inlets. And in those waters, you find mammal-eating killer whales and fish-eating killer whales, but you actually find two different populations of the fish-eating killer whales. You've got the northern residents that range from about the middle of Vancouver Island north into Southeast Alaska. They've been seen out off around Haida Gwaii as well, and certainly the Central Coast. In the autumn, it's a really good time to see them here in Johnston Strait. Being salmon hunters, you can imagine that all the fish returning to all the rivers between Vancouver Island and the mainland, including the big Fraser River runs, need to pass either through this channel here or through Juan de Fuca Strait here. And the northern residents, several groups often park themselves for a week at the time here at the entrance to what we call the salmon funnel and intercept the salmon as they're coming through. The southern residents kind of do the same thing off southern Vancouver Island. They've been seen frequently in the inshore waters, but also spend a lot of time on the outer coast of Washington State, right down to Monterey Bay in California, actually. And they're also spending a lot of time on the west coast of Vancouver Island on these offshore banks here. So you've got the two fish-eating population, but you also have the a mammal-eating West Coast transient population, and their range effectively is from Monterey Bay down in California all the way up to Glacier Bay in Alaska. So they're really inhabiting that entire coast. And even the same individuals have been seen in Glacier Bay and then a few months later in Monterey Bay in California. One of the great things about killer whales that many of you will know already is that you can consistently identify all individuals. So here's a dorsal fin of a female transient killer whale. You see that very characteristic shark fin. But you don't only know that she's a transient, you don't only know that she's a female, because, for example, she's got a very distinct notch in her dorsal fin, and she's got very distinct pigmentation patterns. And from those details, we can identify each individual population. And certainly for the residents, every individual is photographed every 1 or 2 years. And so we have very rich population data on social patterns in the population, birth and death rates, and social affiliations between individuals. From that information, colleagues of mine at Pacific Biological Station have been able to put these catalogs together. And this is a very typical resident matroline. So these are now the fish-eating killer whales. And this is a group that we call A34 matroline. And it's led by individual female A34, who was born in 1975. We know that exactly because she was first seen that year as a young calf with her mother A12. And over the years, A34 had her own kids. So she had a son born 1990. So when she was 15 years old, a daughter born 1994, another daughter born 1997, and another son 2004, and another daughter 2010. So she's doing really well. She's got a nice family around her, and two of her daughters now also have offspring of their own. So A64 has a son, A63. A91, daughter, sorry, another son, A91, and another son, A107. And similarly, A67 has two kids as well. The interesting thing about these fish-eating killer whales is that this is a closed social group. So all the animals will always travel together. So A55, even though he's now, in his best years, he's fully mature. If anything, he's getting a bit geriatric. He's still always traveling with his mother, and he will travel with his mother as long as that mother is alive. And similarly, A62 and A67 and their kids will always be found with A34 as long as A34 is alive. Only when she dies will they start spending more and more time apart and eventually form their own matrilines. No juvenile dispersal at all in these fish-eating killer whales, completely closed social groups, and a lot of sort of social interactions. And it may well be that A34 is not just looking after herself, but she's also supporting her sons and her daughters and presumably her grandkids by catching fish for them and provisioning them with fish. So really interesting social structure in these residents. Transients have a similar social structure. So this is the social group of T68. T68 is a matriline born on or in or before 1970, and she gave birth to T68B in 1987 and T68C in 1992. She's also got a grown son, T68A, who's usually traveling with her. But unlike the fish-eating killer whales, her daughters are often traveling by themselves. And as you can see, T68 is now a great-grandmother to T68 BA1. So 3 generations in this matriline, But unlike the fish-eating killer whales, these subgroups are often traveling on their own. So you see that great flexibility and differences in social behavior between the fish-eating and the mammal-eating killer whales, probably all driven by prey availability. Um, want to tell you a little bit about a technology that we use to study killer whales. And, you can imagine that if you are interested in animal behavior, but you're studying sea mammals, it can be a very frustrating job because you see the animals at the surface when they're breathing. You can use an underwater microphone, a hydrophone to record their sounds, but you never actually get an idea of what's happening underwater as the animals are calling to each other. We didn't used to have much information how they detected their prey, how they chased their prey, how they processed their prey, until this really cool technology came along. And these are the so-called digital recording tags or DTags. And they were developed originally at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, really to study the underwater behavior of animals, of marine mammals, initially on right whales to see how they respond to approaching boats, but they were also extremely useful for other species since. The tags are attached to the animal using these four suction cups. I've had one stuck to myself. It doesn't hurt in any way. It's just a suction cup. You may wonder how you deploy a D-tag on an animal. The answer is simply you drive very softly and you carry a big stick. This is my friend and colleague Mike DeRoos, who is just about to tag this resident killer whale. And so, effectively, we use a boat that's designed to be extremely quiet, a boat used by Fisheries and Oceans Canada specifically for the killer whale research. It's got propellers that are very quiet and don't cavitate. And these animals seem to be quite comfortable around this boat. And that's why we had reasonable success actually tagging these animals. When the tag goes on, often there's a little bit of a flinch in the animal, but within a dive or two, the animals return to their normal behavior. The tag then stays on for up to 16 hours, at which point it detaches from the animal, floats to the surface, and we can use a VHF antenna to find it and download all the data. While it's on the animal, it actually records the movements of the animal. So it's got the same technology as this mobile phone that knows which way is up. And that technology, accelerometry, allows us to reconstruct the underwater movements of the tagged whale while the tag is on. But even better, especially for bioacousticians like myself, the tag also has two underwater microphones, hydrophones on it, and records underwater sound at very, very good quality. So you actually can hear everything that the animal hears. You can also hear any echolocation clicks it makes, any pulse calls that it makes, and relate those to the animal's underwater behavior, which is just super exciting. And so they really provide very useful information on underwater movements. We can use them to quantify foraging success. How often, for example, do fish-eating killer whales catch salmon? And we can even get data at nighttime when we can't see the animals and follow them visually. So a really exciting technology, and it's really moved the field of killer whale research forward substantially. This is one of our tracks on a fish-eating killer whale. I believe that's A37. And you can see here, he's usually at the surface doing these short dives as he's catching a breath. Does that for a while, gets a lot of air, and then he starts doing these longer dives. And during this particular study, we actually followed him, and every time he came up um, from a long dive, We let him move away a little bit and then took the boat to where he had surfaced and looked for salmon scales in the area where he surfaced. If we recovered salmon scales, that was obviously very good evidence that during that particular dive, he had caught a fish, and that allowed us to then actually identify feeding events just from the movement records. And you can see here in these red dives, those are the ones when A37 came up after a successful foraging dive. So sometime during this dive, he had clearly caught a salmon, took it up to the surface, and then processed it and ate it. The other thing that the tags provide us is underwater sound, and I've given you some sound clips here of recordings of tagged killer whales. These are now from the transients from mammal-eating killer whales. And so obviously the tags record the communication calls of those animals. Here is what transients sound like. And you can see or hear that some of these calls are quite loud initially. This is probably the tagged animal itself, but then in the end, you hear some more distant calls, and this is other whales calling back to it. So really interesting. We can then see if, the animal changes direction, if it picks up the calls of other individuals. The other thing that these calls are really useful for is that transients typically are very silent as they're hunting. They're hunting sea mammals. Sea mammals have good hearing, and as a result, transients tend to not call as they're hunting because as soon as they do, all the seals know, okay, there's killer whales around. They make some good career moves and get out of the water or hide in places. When you hear calls, it's often an indicator that the animals are either socializing, so not actively hunting, or very often after a successful kill, you also hear these calls. And so, this shows here that vocal behavior tends to occur after successful feeding events. So as soon as you hear calls, it's a good idea to sort of tune in and see if perhaps the animals have made a kill. The tags also record, obviously, echolocation behavior. This is what this sounds like. So these creaking door sounds, the animals are firing sound pulses in the environment, are listening for the echoes coming back, are using that to detect prey. In the case of the residents or in the transients, they're probably tracking a seal carcass as it's floating in the water. Transients don't tend to echolocate as they're hunting, presumably because, again, the seals would pick up on them. We suspect that they rely on passive listening, that they're listening for sounds that the prey makes, but I'll show you some data on that in a moment. But certainly after a successful predation event, the echolocation rates go up. And again, once you start hearing these sounds, it's a good idea to think, have they just perhaps caught a seal? The best sounds, however, to tell you that killer whales, both the residents and the transients, have been successful are these that we call the killing, ramming, and crushing sounds, the so-called cracks. And they sound pretty much what you would expect to hear as a killer whale either chomps down on a big salmon or as a group of killer whales dismantles a poor harbor seal. So this is a recording of these sounds from transient killer whales. And obviously, once you start hearing these sounds, okay, these animals have just made a kill and they're now feeding on a sea mammal. So it's a really useful technology to actually look at the feeding success of these animals. How often are they catching prey? Which individuals are more successful than others, and so on. And once you hear these sounds, don't only know that they've attacked a prey item, but also that this attack has been successful. I'm going to show you some data from Southeast Alaska, where I have worked. And these are the dive records of tags on transient killer whales in Southeast Alaska. And one of the mysteries about the transients was because they're not using their echolocation to find prey. One of the questions we had is how do they actually find a seal, a sea lion, a porpoise, and so on? One theory was that they might be swimming deep down, looking up at the surface, and if they see a seal at the surface above them, they might attack it from below. But obviously, they would only be able to do that in daylight conditions and would struggle to do that at night. The other hypothesis was that they're actually listening for their prey. So they're listening for breathing sounds of seals at the surface. They may be listening for the echolocation clicks of harbor porpoise or Dawes porpoise and using those to localize their prey. And so what we did is we went to Southeast Alaska in July. And what you can see here in gray is the time when it's actually reasonably dark in Southeast Alaska in July. It's not a long period, but it does actually get dark enough that you would have to turn your car headlights on. And what you can see, first of all, this is the dive depth of the animal. This tag here went on at 7 p.m., stayed on during the night, and then it came off the animal at 8 a.m. the following morning. What you see in these three tags, there are some subtle differences in the diving behavior, but the animals are not completely switching into a new behavior after nightfall. They're kind of continuing to do what they had done previously. The red dots show when we recorded these prey handling sounds. And what you can see here, this individual T65B, we actually tagged her as they were attacking a sea lion. And, the good news was, even though we tagged her, she still quite happily continued to feed on that sea lion. But it's very clear that they made another kill here just after it got dark. T91 here, one kill in the evening and another one in the morning, but no feeding behavior at nighttime. And T103, as far as we could tell, didn't catch anything while the tag was on. You can also see that each predation event is associated with a cluster of vocal behavior, but there are actually incidents when the animals are vocalizing, when they're calling to each other, when they're not feeding as well. Here are some more tags. These are now from juvenile animals. And again, no very striking differences in the diving behavior from day to night. If anything, the dives get a bit deeper here in this individual and this individual, but the animals certainly are continuing to be active at nighttime. And again, you do see very clear evidence of nighttime foraging. So a very clear feeding event here, again, just after nightfall, and then two more in the morning. We know that this was a Dawes porpoise kill because we actually saw the animals as they were attacking it right around the boat in the headlights of the boat. And then two more Dawes porpoise kills in the morning. T73A1 also was involved in a kill before dawn. And here T68B2, this is one of the individuals in the matroland that I'd shown you previously. There are these consistent clusters of these crunching sounds. And initially, we didn't know if this was perhaps one big prey item that they caught at about 2:15 in the morning and then continued to snack on. But it really seems like that these are actually individual predation events. And that's mostly because they do vocalize after each kill, but then between the clusters, there are one or two silent dives of 15 to 20 minutes. And so we're actually thinking that these are either five or perhaps even seven individual predation events. This animal we tagged in a fjord up in Southeast Alaska called Endicott Arm. And Endicott Arm at the end has a tidal glacier and lots of seals breeding on there. And just about this time of year in July, the young seal pups are starting to move out of Endicott Arm. And so our suspicion is here that the animals were actually feeding on these young seal pups. So we refer to them as popcorn or wiener sausages because they're just recently weaned. Um, anyway, so this is some information on the mammal-eating killer whales. I'll also show you some research on the fish-eating killer whales now that I've been involved in, and just a bit of background information. I mentioned the two populations, the northern resident population, the southern resident population. Both populations, when they were first started in the 1970s, had been heavily affected by live captures. As you may know, a lot of killer whales from British Columbia were removed and then lived out their days in SeaWorld and other facilities. And that had a massive implication on the populations. Effectively, entire matrilines, entire groups were penned up. The young individuals were removed. The old individuals were let go again. And as a result, an entire generation is missing from both populations. Now, the northern residents, which is a great news story, is actually recovered from this. So initially, when they were first described, we were looking at just under 150 individuals, and they have now recently topped 300. So this population has doubled in size, which has to be fantastic. We always hear doom and gloom in all conservation issues, but these animals are actually doing reasonably well. Very different stories for the southern residents. They were first described at about 80 individuals. They nearly hit 100 at some point, but they've been completely flatlining and the population is not increasing. And they're currently at 76 individuals. And, critically endangered both in Canada and US legislation. And so we were quite fortunate that we were doing the research on the northern residents just as colleagues working for the National Marine Fisheries Lab were working on the southern residents. And we're using exactly the same technology, the D-tags, exactly the same procedures. So here was actually an opportunity to compare foraging success in these two populations. One thing that was known already is that these animals are highly dependent on the big Chinook salmon. So what you can see here in these graphs are the Chinook salmon abundance, 0.5 meaning a very poor Chinook year, 1.5 meaning a very good Chinook year, and you can see the mortality index the following year. And what that means is if Chinook abundance is low, you get high mortality. If Chinook abundance is high, you get very low mortality. On the right, you see the same, but now you're actually looking at the birth index, how many calves are born in the following year, and it's the opposite. So if Chinook abundance is low, you get a low birth rate. But if Chinook abundance is high, you get a higher birth rate. And so that really shows how dependent these killer whale populations are on the Pacific salmon and specifically on the big Chinook salmon. I think that's really important to keep that in mind, that when decisions are made about quotas, the northern and the southern resident killer whales need to get their share of the salmon quota as well, because they completely depend on them. And obviously, salmon are complex to conserve because they spawn way up the Fraser River, the Columbia River, And, when it comes to declaring critical habitat for killer whales, you actually need to think about their prey as well. Here is some research by my colleague Brianna Wright, who analyzed the DTAG data. And this shows a classic dive by a fish-eating killer whale. And you can see that the animal is doing a first short dive and doing a lot of echolocation, which is indicated by these black lines here. And it almost seems like perhaps during this dive, it already detected a Chinook salmon. It then went up, got lots of air. So these are breathing dives, and then echolocated again, went down to greater depth, echolocating almost continuously. And then here probably captured the salmon. And as it came up with the salmon, started chomping down on it. And we started hearing these prey handling sounds. And so we now actually have, a good way of, from the dive record alone and the acoustic record, of determining when killer whales catch their food. Here are some more foraging dives, and the color coding here actually shows the orientation of the animal. So if the animal's zero, it means it's right side up. If it's in the dark red, it's actually almost upside down. And the one thing that's very typical of these foraging dives, so these are dives when the animal came up and we were able to recover salmon scales, is that there's a lot of upside down swimming. And again, that tells us that this is probably foraging activity. Here is some analysis that Brianna did to characterize what makes foraging dives. And for example, you can look at the swim speed, and you can see that the foraging dives indicated by the letter F have very fast and ascent and descent rates. So the animals are going down quickly, they're coming up quickly after they've caught the salmon. And they're also indicated by a lot of rolling behavior upside down. If you look at the maximum roll in the foraging dives is consistently higher than the other dives. So again, just to give us that tool that we can now look at the whole tag records and say, okay, this is when this particular individual caught a salmon. And this allowed us then to look at the foraging success of northern and southern residents. And you can see both populations here on the left, the northern residents killer whales, on the right, the southern resident killer whales. And you can also see the females in blue and the males in red. And what this shows is that the northern resident killer whales, the females actually have higher foraging success than the males. And that's kind of what you expect, because many of these females are supporting young, either their own young, or in the case of the matriarchs, actually their grandkids. The males have slightly lower foraging success, but interestingly, or slightly, worryingly, this is reversed in the southern residents. So in the southern residents, our colleagues found lower foraging success in the females compared to the males. And that goes both for the prey capture rate over the entire tag deployment, or only the time when the animals were actively engaged in foraging behavior. In both cases, you've got reverse sex specific foraging success, high success in the resident males, and the northern resident males, lower success in the northern resident females, but low success in the southern resident females and higher success in the males, which is worrying. The other thing that we looked at with those data were, how does actually underwater noise affect the foraging success? Obviously, these fish-eating killer whales are using their echolocation to track the salmon. They're making these very loud sound pulses. They're listening for faint echoes coming back. If there's now a noisy boat in the vicinity, they may not be able to detect the echoes at the same distances. And if you look at these data, again, you've got the females in um, blue and the males in gray. And in both sexes, in quiet conditions, the animals have good foraging success, but their foraging success actually consistently decreases in louder conditions here, characterized by 130 decibel background noise. And that is true for both the northern residents and southern residents. And the lesson here really is if we want to create good habitat for these animals, we need to manage underwater noise around them because, whereas in quiet conditions, they can probably detect a salmon up to 200 meters away. In noisy condition, that may decrease to 50 meters or even less. And so effectively massively decreasing the foraging success of these animals. This is where I'll leave it. Just a few take-home messages. The first one is that the transient killer whales very rarely use their echolocation. And the fact that they had good foraging success in complete darkness suggests that they're not just using vision. And that really leaves that passive listening hypothesis, listening for the sounds made by seals, porpoises, in order to localize them. Resident killer whales are very specialized. They're Chinook salmon specialists, and they're using their echolocation to track them. And so, yeah, I think what this shows is that, in both cases, transients using passive listening, residents using their echolocation, listening for those faint echoes coming back. Underwater noise is a real concern that we need to look at and manage if we want to, make sure that these fantastic animals continue to be a part of the fauna of the British Columbia coast. Thanks very much to everyone. I'll just end with a brief recording of some killer whales in quiet conditions, and also a big thanks to everyone who helped. And obviously very happy to take any questions afterwards. Thank you very much. Just really nice to hear what quiet oceans should sound like. Thank you very much. Any questions from you?
Amazing. Thanks, Volker. I will. Several questions are pouring into the chat, and I'll
Excellent.
convey them to you. So, the first question is just showing the person's name is showing up as Trav, but says, I've heard that orcas engage in cooperative hunting and that some may derive prey to protected bay for ease of capture. Can you speak to that? Do both of the ecotypes do that?
Definitely. So it's slightly different. The transients are definitely very coordinated and cooperative in their hunting. There have been several incidents where a group of transients, for example, has driven a big aggregation of Pacific white-sided dolphins into shallow bays and attack them there. And that obviously needs a lot of cooperation between the animals. Transients, if anybody has ever seen transient killer whales attacking Dall's porpoises, that's also extremely cooperative behavior. Russ, I can see you're nodding. Dawes porpoise are extremely fast and can easily actually outswim a killer whale. But by working in a group and almost doing a relay race, the killer whales are able to tire the porpoise out and eventually sort of capture it with a really spectacular leap onto the back of the porpoise. So it's a bit like, African hunting dogs or lions working together to wear out a prey item. Interestingly, the residents, the ones with the really tight family groups, tend to be quite spread out when they're foraging, and it may well be each whale to his or her own during foraging. So most of the hunting of Chinook salmon seems to be happening individually. But when an animal comes up to the surface, it very often bites the salmon in half and what looks like quite deliberately passes off half of the fish to another killer whale, usually a relative, but sometimes even an unrelated individual. So there's cooperation in both species, but it looks differently with transients working together as a team to subdue the prey. The residents catching the prey individually, but then sharing it afterwards.
Awesome, thanks. And Pierre asks, considering strong social structure and limited populations, how do they prevent inbreeding? Hmm.
Really interesting question. And it's one of these really fascinating parallels between human cultures and animal cultures. So, John Ford first described the dialects of the northern residents and the southern residents, and he found in that, first of all, each matriline has its own unique vocal signature. And, I did my master's on, for example, the A clan matrilines, and I can still tell a 34 matriline from a 50 matriline because, they put little upsweeps at the end of some calls. So it's really subtle differences, but consistent and identifiable. Bit like, somebody from the US sounds different than somebody from Canada, from the UK, and so on. But in the Northern Residents, you actually have three acoustic clans. And a clan is defined as all the animals that share at least one call type in their repertoire. And so you've got A clan, and all the A clan animals share at least the resting call, the N3. You've got G clan, they all share one call type, and you've got R clan. And interestingly, John Ford used that word clan because it kind of seemed to make sense, but it is actually, parallel to the clans in First Nations communities in British Columbia. When Lance Barrett Leonard looked at paternity in these killer whales, so we always know who the mother is because the calf swims with the mother, certainly for the first year, closely by her side, but we didn't used to know who the fathers were. Lance used biopsy samples, so little tissue samples from the animals, to identify who the fathers were. And where he was able to determine paternity, the male always came from a different acoustic clan. And so, the acoustic signature is probably learned from the mother. It's clearly a learned behavior pattern because they're traveling with maternal relatives. That's how the acoustic repertoire is formed. But when it comes to mating, the females are choosing males that sound very different, come from a different acoustic clan. And that simple rule can actually avoid breeding because they're at the very least, they're avoiding mating with close maternal relatives. Now, in a First Nations community, many of them have eagle clan and raven clan. That's the standard one. You also have a grizzly bear clan, and some Haida Gwaii even has a fin whale clan. But the rule was always that you had to marry somebody from outside your clan, and clan identity was transmitted from the mother. So if your mother was a raven, you are a raven and you have to marry an eagle. And the system is, surprisingly analogous in the killer whales. Your clan identity, the acoustic repertoire comes from your mother, and you mate with somebody who sounds very different. So that's works very well in the residence. And, in these small populations of 300 individuals, that's probably extremely important to avoid inbreeding. The transients at about 600 individuals, it's not so much of an issue. And transients don't have that very fine-grained vocal variation. All transients from California all the way up to to Southeast Alaska share a certain part of their vocal repertoire, so they don't have that intricate clan system. I hope that answers the question.
That's great. Thanks. Maybe I'll try to lump together several questions here about just the impacts of noise pollution. It's really
Mhm.
kind of surprised a lot of people. And Barbara says, wow, 130 decibels seems very loud. Where does it come from? And Renee asks about more ongoing studies, work looking at specific impacts of underwater noise on killer whales. And someone also asked, what can we do to help reduce underwater noise on the west coast of BC?
Those are really good questions. So 130 decibels is certainly loud. These are probably all the noise that we experienced in our data set came from commercial shipping. These could be container ships, these could be freighters going through Johnson Strait or Juan de Fuca Strait. Um, the frustrating thing, I mean, first of all, yes, more research would be nice, but I think we already know that there is a problem. And I think, rather than more research, we need to do something about it. And the frustrating thing is that we can actually do something about it. I had this epiphany when I was doing my PhD in Johnson Strait of seeing a US Navy minesweeper go past. And at the time, I had my hydrophone in the water, and, I see this ship go by and I hear nothing. And I start sort of futzing about with my wires in case my hydrophone's not working. No, it was working fine, but that ship put no noise out. So the technologies are there to
Hmm.
make ships quiet. And obviously the Navy's using them because they don't want their ships to be detectable by submarines. And so, if we've got the technology, let's, implement it. Fisheries and Oceans has done it really well. The one boat that spends so much time researching these killer whales is specifically designed with an Arneson drive, surface piercing so it doesn't cavitate. The engine is mounted on rubber shocks. And, as a result, it is quiet. The big problem are the big container ships, and there are now some incentives underway. So, the Port of Vancouver is under very strict obligations not to increase noise in the southern resident habitat. And as a result, they may be implementing guidelines that you can only access this port if your ship puts out less than this amount of decibels. And I think that's the way forward. We need to make legislation on ships that if you want to access this port, you need to meet these criteria. Effectively, what we're doing in the marine environment is driving cars without mufflers. We've put mufflers on our car because we find that noise very annoying, but obviously we don't have the ears underwater. So, we have ignored to our peril the noise pollution in the marine environment.
Super helpful. Thanks. Just a couple more. Richard asks, how will or does AI contribute to your research or perhaps the broader research community in this field?
We haven't done that much. I mean, I've done a little bit using artificial neural networks to classify killer whale sounds. Actually, I should say we are actually using it a fair bit, sorry. And, we are now monitoring animals often with remote underwater recorders. So if you want to find out where killer whales are, for example, in the winter time, you could either, run very expensive boat surveys in very horrible conditions, or you can drop an autonomous acoustic recorder on the sea floor, and it may record sound for 5 minutes every hour. And then if, for example, a 50 matterline swims by, we can pick up these calls and, we can put a map on the dot that these animals were seen there. The problem with these acoustic recorders is that they generate a lot of information. If you record it for an hour, it'll take you an hour to go through that recording, and that's where automated detection comes in. So there are algorithms that you can use, and it will tell you, okay, this is likely a killer whale call, this is likely killer whale echolocation, this is likely Pacific white-sided dolphin. So we are using these detectors for acoustic detection. There are also not so much for killer whales because the numbers are quite manageable, but certainly for humpback whales, there are now there's a system called Happy Whale that uses AI to identify flukes. So, you can put a photograph into Happy Whale and it'll give you 5 possible matches. And that can save you a lot of time because, obviously, if you've got one individual that you photographed and you've got a catalog of 1,000 fluke shots, that's a lot of time going through and comparing each individually. And that's where AI can come in and be quite helpful. So hopefully that's answered that question to some degree.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thanks, Volker. And just following on that, Bill from Haida was just asking about website, I guess Jared Towers has been involved in called FinWave. And
Mhm.
yeah, I think the question is really, I mean, it'd be amazing if down the road the general public are able to upload their images and have them identified, and so that we could all track our sightings of killer whales throughout the BC coast. That'll be pretty amazing.
That's really important, that citizen science. Certainly in Shetland, where I've worked a lot, we did some dedicated research, which is now being carried on by the local community with good cameras. And the great thing about the Shetland killer whales is they're often quite close to shore. And so we're getting really good photo ID photographs from the general public. And, we can actually just sit in our office and let the data come to us. And similarly on the British Columbia coast, there's been the BC Cetacean Sightings Network that has really produced a lot of very valuable data on where different species are, identified critical habitat, identified seasonal trends, but also, good quality photographs of the killer whales can actually tell us which individuals are using which areas. So, yeah, the general public can be extremely valuable and can make a really valuable contribution to the research.
Amazing. You good for one more question, Volker?
Absolutely, yeah.
This one's a technical question from Harley, who asks, could you speak to the difference between air and marine acoustics, sound, speed, and intensity? That
Ooh,
makes
that's very technical.
yeah, and ocean feeding conditions for killer whales so critical. And I'll add, Volker did include his email address at the top of his. There's some of these we could probably follow up with if you really want to drill.
Absolutely. Do free if you haven't noted it down, if you just Google Volker and Cumbria, I'll come up very quickly. So one of the benefits of having a slightly bizarre first name. The question that's a really challenging one. So first of all, sound behaves very differently in air and in water. Sound propagates much better underwater, and that's something we need to be aware of. So, you know, Whereas a loud noise in a truck going by on the street, you may hear it from 500 meters away, but then it actually dissipates very quickly. That same thing's not going to happen underwater. It attenuates much more slowly. The other difference is the difference of speed of sound. So sound travels faster through the water. I remember having this really interesting observation where I was sitting on my boat, had the hydrophone in the water, and watching a breaching humpback whale, probably about 500 meters away. And I could obviously see the animal slam back into the water. Then, a split second later, I heard it on my hydrophone. And then another split second later, I heard it in the air because obviously the sound waves travel slower through the air than the hydrophone. So um,
Mm.
sound speed is different, but I think the main key in terms of conservation is that sound attenuates much more slowly underwater. So the same sound source is going to be heard over much greater distance in the aquatic environment. The medium is so different. Air is compressible, water isn't. And as a result, the sound waves behave very different in both environments. And it's very difficult and very misleading. So, for example, the 130 decibels that I've shown, that doesn't necessarily translate into the 130 decibel sound in air. Physicists will always tell you don't even try to compare sound waves in air and water. The medium is so different that you can't really make that comparison. But we do know what the loudest natural sounds are underwater, and that's about 200 decibels. So 130 is definitely a loud noise by any standard.
Amazing. Thank you, Volker. And just before we let you go, can you, for those of us who are out there on the water, moving around the boats different times a year, and we come across a group of transients,
Mhm.
how do we, what's your insights? Like, how are the transients deciding where and when they're ranging between Vancouver Island and Southeast Alaska, or what's driving there? How do they know where and when they're going?
That's a really good question, and we do feel that there's something, these are long-lived animals, a female transient can live up to 90 years. Same with the residents. And, over her lifespan, she's probably accumulated a lot of knowledge, a bit like ourselves. Initially, we start out quite clueless, and then we know, where the good food is and when to get it. And over time, that female has probably also accumulated a lot of knowledge and is passing that on to her daughters when she travels with them. So probably a lot of, what we call cultural transmission, where the offspring are learning from their mothers when certain food sources are becoming abundant in certain places.
Perfect. Yeah. Amazing. Thank you, Volker. Lots of in the chat, lots of people are, huge thanks to incredible talk and all the great information. And so many thanks from so many people. So.